All that is solid melts into air. One of the great themes of modern architecture was the idea of organicism. Among other things, this was taken to mean that architecture might not only be integrated with nature, but that it might itself be nature, a living, breathing, sometimes sentient thing. Architect Louis Sullivan, a great reader of the American Transcendentalists and of the philosopher Henri Bergson, spoke of buildings as bearing an élan vital, a life force. Years later, Louis Kahn talked of architecture as a willful thing. What does the building want to be, he asked. Here I'm interested in one part of the architectural life cycle, the last part. All things living die, and we, the not yet dead, devotees of car crashes and slasher films, like to watch. We do this because it makes us feel better about ourselves, but also because it's sometimes exciting, sometimes beautiful, often horrible, always interesting. People have looked at and made pictures of dead or dying buildings for a long time, but it wasn't until the 1990s that destructo tourism emerged. Las Vegas, that most provisional of American cities, was its epicenter. Crowds gathered there to watch the death throes of the landmark, the sands, the castaways. 600,000 people convened to see the Hacienda go down on New Year's Eve, '96. The mood was festive. Liquor and music flowed. There was a moment of silence after the countdown ended and before the fireworks burst forth. This was followed by a series of explosions and the eruption of the crowd as the building fell. There is for many a profound fascination in destruction, a sort of awful beauty even, something that many have struggled with in talking about the attacks of 9/11. There's something perverse about a building in motion, something so solid, so massive, so static, becoming suddenly fluid, falling like an animal struck by a bullet. This is related to what historian David Nye has called the technological sublime, that sense of awe, of terror, approaching a kind of transcendence that we might experience as we witness, ideally from a safe distance in an Adirondack chair, great spectacles of modern technology, a rocket blast, an atomic bomb blast, an implosion. Doug Loiseau of Controlled Demolition Incorporated has spoken of the crowds that come to see his work. I used to think they came to see implosions the way you go to see car races to see a crash, but it's not that. Looking at something so large and seeing it reduced to nothing in a matter of seconds gives them a feeling of power. I've always thought there was something a little pornographic to this, and I mean that in a nice way. These big stage de-erections of phallic towers, these lurid spectacles happening under hot lights while the music throbs and the punters gawk. The excitement mounts and concentrates, finally released in a shower of sparks. The moment of collapse is the money shot. Love American style. Listen to Mark Loiseau on the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe complex. He not only humanizes the building, he feminizes it. In so doing, he conjures images of destructive violence and sexual dominance. I think of a building as a person. That building is fighting me, and I've got to bring her to her knees the first time. Or take the comments of Vinnie Downs, one of 250,000 spectators on hand to see the dunes go down in October of '93. Vinnie'd seen previous implosions and panted that we're going to feel this thing like a nuclear explosion. It's going to hit and hit again. It's going to be better than sex. I've always wondered if there was a Mrs. Downs, and, well, never mind. So there we have it, an extraordinary visual event combining classic themes of Eros and Thanatos, love and death, demolition as violent, destructive act and as sexual release. A little death, as the French say, but on a large scale. No one got this better than that noted sociopath and libertarian diva, which is kind of the same thing, Ayn Rand. In The Fountainhead, beefcake architect Howard Rourke and sex kitten art critic Dominique Franchon treat love as demolition and demolition as love. When they lay in bed together, Rand writes, it was, as it had to be, as the nature of the act demanded, an act of violence. Later, the ever-peevish Rourke, feeling that his design for the Cortlandt Homes housing project has been compromised, decides to dynamite it. Dominique helps by distracting a watchman. Following Rourke's instructions, she then lies down in a ditch to protect herself from the blast. The ever-excitable Rand describes the scene. She was on her knees, at the bottom, and then stretched flat on her stomach, face down, her mouth pressed to the earth. She felt the pounding in her thighs as she twisted her body once in a long convulsion to feel the earth with her legs, her breasts, the skin of her arms. It was like lying in Rourke's bed. As is so often the case with little deaths, there's the afterglow, and then there are the ruins. The ruins formed by long-term decay, like demolition sites, can be highly eloquent and affecting. They're not only picturesque, they're evocative. They make us think of future as much as past. As they once were, so are we now. As they are now, so will we be. But if ruins are beautiful or moving to us, we still don't want to see our cities reduced to them, except, well, maybe Detroit. Starlet of destructo tourism's sister genre, ruin porn. It's a question of quantity. As biologist Midas Deckers writes, a toothless old man adds charm to your Greek holiday, but 30 minutes in an old people's home is more than most can bear. Demolition involves the erasure of objects in history, but also makes way for the new. Economist Joseph Schumpeter used the term creative destruction to describe the essential process of capitalism. We destroy so that we can rebuild. Architect Rem Koolhaas called the demolitionist the patron saint of the architectural profession. So if we think of buildings as living things, if we think of them as having life cycles comparable to our own, demolition might be analogous to euthanasia or murder, depending on your perspective. Recognizing this, the New York Times in 1931 called one prominent demolitionist the mortician of the building trades. John Webster, in his 1617 play, The Duchess of Malfi, wrote, "All things have their end. Churches and cities which have diseases like to men must have like death that we have." We tend to think of architecture as solid, as stable, enduring. Demolition belies this and makes powerfully evident the vulnerability, the mortality of all things standing.